April 29, 1945, just outside Munich, Germany. The war is nearly over. Spring hangs in the air, cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and cordite. As elements of the U.S. Army advance toward a sprawling complex of low concrete buildings and barbed wire, they expect resistance, perhaps scattered gunfire, perhaps surrender. Instead, they encounter silence. Near the railway spur, boxcars sit motionless in the morning light. Their doors are open. Inside are bodies, stacked, rigid, unmistakable. The smell arrives before understanding does. Sweet, sour, overwhelming. Soldiers stop speaking. Some turn away. Others stare, frozen. Beyond the tracks lies the camp itself, watchtowers, electrified fences, rows of barracks. Prisoners emerge slowly, skeletal figures in striped uniforms, eyes hollow yet fixed on the men now standing at the gates. In that moment, combat discipline collides with something far older and more visceral. What these soldiers see cannot be unseen, and what happens next will challenge the boundaries between justice, rage, and the laws of war. By the spring of 1945, Dachau Concentration Camp was no longer simply a prison. It was the prototype of a system. Established in March 1933, weeks after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, Dachau was the first permanent concentration camp created by the Nazi regime. What began as a site for political opponents, communists, social democrats, dissidents, evolved into a model for repression across the Third Reich. Administratively, Dachau was run by the Schutzstaffel, not as an improvised wartime measure, but as a bureaucratic institution. Guards were trained here. Camp procedures were standardized here. Punishments, roll calls, medical experiments, forced labor routines, all were refined within Dachau's fences before being exported to camps across occupied Europe. By 1944, the camp complex had expanded far beyond its original footprint. More than 30 subcamps surrounded Munich, supplying forced labor to armaments factories, aircraft plants, and construction projects essential to Germany's war effort. Prisoners worked until exhaustion, disease, or execution removed them from the labor rolls. Replacement transports arrived continuously. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west in early 1945, Dachau entered a phase of catastrophic collapse. Food rations dwindled. Medical care ceased to function. Typhus spread unchecked through overcrowded barracks. Corpses accumulated faster than crematoria could process them. The SS response was not evacuation in any humanitarian sense, but liquidation by movement. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced onto death marches southward, away from advancing Allied armies. Many collapsed and were shot where they fell. Others died of exposure or starvation along the roadsides of Bavaria. Those left behind, the sick, the dying, the forgotten, remained inside Dachau as the camp's command structure disintegrated. Some SS guards fled. Others stayed, armed and uncertain, still wearing the uniforms of a regime that was unraveling by the hour. When American forces approached in late April 1945, Dachau stood as a place suspended between operation and abandonment, still guarded, still lethal, but already a graveyard. And it was into this unstable, decaying system that U.S. infantry units would soon walk, with little preparation for what they were about to confront. In late April 1945, the American advance into southern Germany was moving with relentless speed. Organized German resistance was collapsing. Cities fell with minimal fighting. White flags appeared in village windows. For frontline units, the war had become a sequence of roadblocks, brief firefights, and mass surrenders. The U.S. 7th Army pushed east through Bavaria with clear operational priorities: secure transportation hubs, prevent Alpine redoubt formations, and accept the surrender of remaining German forces. Intelligence briefings focused on military targets. Concentration camps, where mentioned at all, were described vaguely: prison facilities, labor compounds, enemy-controlled installations. Few American soldiers understood what those words actually meant. Elements of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, advanced toward Dachau from the west. Nearby, units of the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, approached from the south. These were veteran formations. They had fought through Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, southern France, and the Siegfried Line. They were not inexperienced men, but nothing in their previous campaigns had prepared them for what they were about to encounter. Commanders did not issue special instructions for camp liberation. There were no protocols for mass starvation, epidemic disease, or tens of thousands of civilian prisoners behind barbed wire. The laws of war, drilled into soldiers throughout their training, assumed enemy combatants, uniforms, surrender procedures. Dachau fit none of those categories cleanly. As the divisions neared the camp on the morning of April 29, sporadic gunfire was reported in the surrounding area. Some SS guards remained at their posts. Others attempted to surrender. Confusion spread quickly. Was the camp still defended? Was it mined? Were prisoners hostile, contagious, or both? Then came the rail spur. A long line of freight cars sat just outside the main camp entrance, a transport that had arrived days earlier from Buchenwald. Inside were more than 2,000 corpses, victims of starvation, dehydration, and disease. Many had died during transit. Others had been shot. The bodies had not been removed. There had been no time, or no will. For the American soldiers who discovered the train, the war changed shape instantly. This was not an abstract enemy. This was not a distant crime. It was immediate, physical, undeniable. The smell alone forced men to retch. Hardened infantrymen wept openly. Some vomited. Others stood rigid, gripping their rifles, faces drained of expression. Anger followed by shock. Then something sharper. As U.S. troops entered the camp proper, they found SS guards still present, some armed, some attempting to surrender, some already disarmed by prisoners. The legal status of these men was clear on paper, enemy personnel entitled to surrender and protection. But paper rules felt thin inside a place like Dachau. The officers understood the danger immediately. Discipline had to be maintained. Control had to be asserted. But they were trying to impose order on men who had just walked into a scene that defied every moral boundary they knew. The context for what followed was not a planned reprisal or a standing order. It was a collision, between doctrine and emotion, between military law and human reaction, between the end of a war and the revelation of its deepest crime. That collision would soon erupt into actions that remain among the most controversial moments of the American liberation of Europe. For the American infantrymen, Dachau was not encountered in history. It was shocking. These were men conditioned for violence, but within rules. They had learned how to clear rooms, how to take prisoners, and how to advance under fire. They had not been trained for what lay behind Dachau's wire. Nothing in Sicily or France or the forests of the Hurtgen prepared them for human bodies reduced to evidence, or for survivors who looked more like ghosts than civilian. Many soldiers later recalled the silence first. Not the absence of sound, but its wrongness. No normal movement. No voices raised in greeting or fear, just shuffling feet, coughing. A low murmur that never rose above exhaustion. The prisoners who emerged wore striped uniforms hanging from skeletal frames. Some smiled, some stared, others collapsed where they stood. A few tried to salute, mimicking military formality with hands that trembled too badly to hold steady. For the Americans, this shattered familiar categories. These were not civilians in a liberated town. These were not enemy prisoners of war. These were human beings who had been deliberately stripped of identity, health, and dignity, and left alive just long enough to be found. Soldiers moved through barracks where bunks were stacked 3 high, each crammed with bodies. Many were dead. Others were dying. Some could no longer move. Lice crawled across blankets. The smell of rot and disinfectant mixed with human waste and decay. Several accounts describe men stepping outside to vomit, then returning inside. Again and again. Others describe uncontrollable shaking. Rage followed close behind. This rage did not arrive as shouting or chaos. It arrived quietly. Rifles were gripped more tightly. Faces hardened. Conversation stopped. Men began asking questions, short ones. Who did this? Where are they? And the answers were visible everywhere. SS guards were still present inside the camp when American troops arrived. Some stood at posts, uncertain whether to flee or surrender. Others had already been captured by prisoners. A few attempted to explain themselves. To the soldiers, these explanations sounded like noise, irrelevant, obscene. The discovery of the train magnified everything. Soldiers who had already seen the barracks now saw thousands of bodies packed into railcars like cargo. Many of the dead wore the same striped uniforms as the living men standing behind the fence. This was not an accidental death. This was systematic. Veterans later described a precise moment when the rules of war seemed to dissolve. Not intellectually. Emotionally. The idea that the men responsible should be treated as ordinary prisoners felt impossible to accept. Yet even in that state, discipline did not vanish entirely. Officers attempted to impose structure. Guards were disarmed. Prisoners were told to stay back. Medical personnel were summoned. Orders were shouted and repeated. But the soldiers were no longer operating in a normal combat environment. They were standing inside proof of industrialized murder. And their reactions, controlled or not, unfolded under that pressure. This human angle, raw and immediate, is essential to understanding what followed. Because the actions taken against SS guards at Dachau were not born of ignorance or confusion alone, they were born from exposure to something that permanently altered how these men understood the war. That altered understanding would soon collide with command authority, military law, and the irreversible consequences of acting in the heat of moral outrage. While enlisted men reacted instinctively, officers at Dachau were forced into a different role. They had to impose order inside a place where order itself had been weaponized. Their task was not only to secure the camp, but to do so under the framework of military law, even as that framework strained under unprecedented moral weight. From a legal standpoint, the SS guards at Dachau were enemy combatants. Once disarmed and surrendered, they were entitled to protection under the laws of war. This principle was drilled into every American officer from the first days of training. It existed precisely to prevent revenge killings and breakdowns in discipline. But Dachau tested the limits of that principle. Many SS personnel captured that morning wore clean uniforms. They were fed. They were armed until moments before surrender. Around them lay thousands of corpses and tens of thousands of starving prisoners. The contrast was obscene. Officers later acknowledged that it was nearly impossible to explain to their men why these guards deserved protection when their victims had been denied even the right to live. Some SS guards attempted to distance themselves from responsibility. They claimed administrative roles. They claimed they had followed orders. They claimed ignorance. To the American officers listening, these defenses rang hollow. Dachau had been operating for 12 years. This was not a secret installation. This was not a temporary excess. It was a system. Complicating matters further was the breakdown of German command authority. There was no clear chain of surrender. Some guards attempted to hand themselves over formally. Others discarded weapons and blended into prisoner crowds. A few fired shots in confusion or panic. Each incident raised tension further. Officers tried to centralize control. Guards were herded into holding areas. Prisoners were told to stay back. Machine guns were repositioned to face outward. Medical officers began triage, attempting to prioritize those who might survive. But the emotional state of the troops was deteriorating rapidly. Men who had just hours earlier accepted mass surrenders elsewhere now found themselves guarding perpetrators of mass murder. The abstract idea of enemy personnel could not compete with what they had just seen. This was not unique to Dachau. Similar tensions erupted at other liberated camps across Europe. But Dachau was different in scale, in visibility, and in symbolism. It was the first major concentration camp discovered by American forces. The shockwave traveled fast. Commanders were aware that any loss of discipline here would echo beyond the camp. The eyes of history were already turning toward Dachau, even if the soldiers did not yet know it. Photographers arrived. Correspondence followed. Evidence was being documented for future war crimes trials. That awareness made restraint more urgent, and more fragile. As guards were concentrated near a coal yard within the camp perimeter, a critical mass formed. Angry soldiers. Disarmed SS men. No clear resolution. Orders given, misunderstood, or ignored. The situation tightened like a coiled wire. What happened next did not unfold as a single act or a single decision. It unfolded in moments, fragmented, chaotic, and irreversible. And in those moments, the line between justice and vengeance would be crossed. Late morning, April 29, 1945. Inside Dachau Concentration Camp, the situation reaches a breaking point. A group of captured SS guards, estimates range from several dozen to more than 100, is gathered near a coal yard inside the camp perimeter. They are disarmed. Some sit on the ground. Others stand in loose formation. The guards are under the control of American troops, many of whom have just finished moving through the barracks and the rail line. The emotional state of those soldiers is volatile. Moments earlier, they have seen bodies stacked in freight cars. They have seen living men who weigh scarcely more than children. They have walked through rooms where the dead lie beside the dying. The evidence is not abstract. It is physical. It clings to their uniforms and boots. Accounts differ on the exact trigger. Some describe a sudden burst of gunfire after a perceived movement by the prisoners. Others describe an order misunderstood or ignored. A few recall a machine gun being positioned and fired almost mechanically, as if muscle memory took over before reason could intervene. What is consistent across testimonies is this: Once the firing began, it was brief, violent, and decisive. SS guards fell where they stood or sat. Some attempted to flee. Others raised their hands too late. The gunfire echoed against concrete walls and guard towers that had heard screams for more than a decade, but never this sound. Nearby American officers rushed to intervene. Orders were shouted. Weapons were lowered. The firing stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The number of SS guards killed in this incident has been debated for decades. Contemporary reports, later investigations, and eyewitness accounts offer differing figures. What is not disputed is that prisoners who had surrendered were killed by American troops inside Dachau that day. This was not an organized execution ordered from above. It was not a premeditated reprisal planned in advance. It was a collapse, momentary, explosive, of discipline under extreme moral shock. Elsewhere in the camp, smaller incidents unfolded simultaneously. Individual SS guards were shot while attempting to surrender or while resisting disarmament. In some cases, prisoners themselves attacked guards before American soldiers could intervene. The boundary between combat, custody, and chaos dissolved. For the men involved, the distinction between guard and criminal no longer existed. The uniform itself was enough. Within minutes, officers regained control. Survivors among the SS guards were secured. Prisoners were pushed back. Medical operations resumed. The camp returned to a fragile, imposed order. But the damage was done. The actions taken in the coal yard would follow those involved for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke of it. Others justified it without hesitation. A few struggled with it in silence. All understood that they had crossed a line, even if many believed that line had already been erased by what they had seen. The immediate question now facing American command was unavoidable: how would the U.S. Army respond to its own men? That question would shape not only the official record of Dachau's liberation, but the moral legacy of one of the war's most searing days. The gunfire ends as suddenly as it began. American officers forced themselves between armed men and the remaining SS prisoners. Voices cut through the noise, sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Weapons are lowered. The surviving guards are separated and moved under tighter control. What moments earlier threatened to spiral into broader violence is pulled back from the edge by command presence and authority. Inside Dachau Concentration Camp, the priorities shift rapidly. The camp is now fully secured. Guard towers are occupied by U.S. troops. Perimeter defenses are turned outward. Any remaining SS personnel are hunted down, disarmed, and detained. Prisoners are ordered, firmly but carefully, to remain in place. Many are too weak to move anyway. Attention turns to survival. American medical officers and medics enter barracks where men lie stacked on bunks, some alive, some already dead. Typhus is rampant. Dysentery. Starvation, edema. Soldiers who hours earlier were fighting enemies now find themselves lifting bodies that weigh less than their field packs. Food distribution becomes a crisis of its own. Well-meaning soldiers begin handing out rations, only to be warned that sudden feeding can kill starved men. Orders are issued. Kitchens are organized. Doctors attempt to impose controlled nourishment, knowing that even careful intervention will come too late for many. The psychological state of the liberating troops is visibly altered. Some move with grim focus, clinging to procedure as a lifeline. Others withdraw inward, silent and distant. A few break down completely once the immediate danger passes. Officers begin documenting everything. Photographers capture images that will soon circulate across the world: piles of corpses, skeletal survivors, abandoned guard posts. Written reports are compiled. Witness statements are taken. The U.S. Army understands that Dachau is not just a military objective. It is evidence. Within hours, higher command is informed of the shootings of SS guards. The incident cannot be hidden. Too many witnesses. Too much attention. Too much history pressing in on the moment. The immediate response is cautious. There is no public condemnation. There is no praise. There is an understanding, unspoken but present, that what happened occurred under extraordinary circumstances. Yet the army is also an institution built on discipline. It cannot simply look away. As night falls over Dachau on April 29, 1945, floodlights illuminate the camp. Survivors sleep where they can. Medics work through exhaustion. Guards stand watch, Americans now, rifles slung low, eyes scanning a place that no longer feels real. For the SS men who survived that day, captivity has replaced authority. For the American soldiers, the war has changed forever. Victory now carries weight, moral weight, heavier than any battlefield loss. And for U.S. command, the question remains unresolved. How should justice be measured when confronted with systematic evil? That question will follow the liberation of Dachau beyond the camp's fences, into investigations, reports, and the uneasy silence of official conclusion. The shooting of SS guards at Dachau did not fade into rumor. It was recorded almost immediately. Officers filed reports. Medical personnel documented deaths. Photographers preserved scenes that could not be undone. Within hours, the incident reached higher headquarters. The U.S. Army faced a dilemma with no clean resolution. On one hand, the killings violated the laws of war. Enemy personnel who had surrendered were not to be harmed. This principle was foundational, not only legally, but morally. On the other hand, Dachau represented a crime of such scale and clarity that conventional frameworks struggled to contain it. Commanders understood that what their men had seen would permanently alter judgment. An official investigation was initiated under the authority of the U.S. 7th Army. Witness statements were gathered from officers and enlisted men. Accounts varied, sometimes sharply. Some emphasized confusion and perceived threats. Others admitted to uncontrolled rage. No one disputed the underlying context, the discovery of mass murder. The investigation moved upward through the chain of command until it reached the desk of George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. 7th Army. Patton was no stranger to controversy, discipline, or moral gray zones. He had demanded strict adherence to military order throughout his campaigns, but he had also seen the camps. Patton reviewed the findings and made a decision that would shape Dachau's legacy for decades. The charges were dismissed. No court-martial followed. No formal punishments were issued. The rationale was never publicly articulated in detail, but internal correspondence made the logic clear. The incident was deemed an aberration, occurring under extreme emotional stress, immediately following the exposure to unprecedented atrocities. Pursuing prosecutions, Patton believed, would serve no constructive purpose and could fracture morale at the very end of the war. The decision was administrative, not celebratory. There were no commendations, no justifications issued to the press. The matter was quietly closed. This silence was deliberate. The U.S. Army was preparing to present overwhelming evidence of German war crimes to the world. Dachau itself would become a centerpiece of that effort. Dwelling publicly on American misconduct, however contextualized, risked muddying a moral narrative that was otherwise brutally clear. Within the ranks, reactions were mixed. Some officers were relieved. Others were uneasy. A few believed discipline had been compromised. Many enlisted men never learned how close the incident came to formal charges. Those who did carried the knowledge quietly. For the SS personnel who survived, captivity led not to summary justice, but to formal processing. Many would later face trial in post-war proceedings. Others disappeared into the vast machinery of occupation and denazification. The army, meanwhile, turned its attention back to the living. Dachau was no longer a combat zone. It was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Thousands of survivors were critically ill. Hundreds died in the days following liberation. Despite medical intervention, victory had arrived too late for many. And yet, the moral weight of what had occurred inside the camp, both before and during liberation, continued to press inward. The aftermath of Dachau was not confined to reports or rulings. It followed the men who walked through its gates, shaping memory, silence, and the uneasy understanding that even just wars can leave stains that never fully fade. With the camp secured, the focus at Dachau shifted from justice to survival. For the tens of thousands of prisoners still alive on April 29, 1945, liberation did not mean immediate safety. Many were already beyond recovery. American medical teams worked under conditions closer to disaster relief than military medicine. Barracks were converted into makeshift hospitals. Doctors confronted diseases rarely seen by U.S. forces: advanced typhus, tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, and starvation-induced organ failure. The most dangerous threat was sudden feeding. Men who had not eaten properly for months could die if given normal rations. Carefully measured diets were introduced, but the margin for error was thin. Despite these efforts, hundreds of former prisoners died in the days and weeks following liberation. Their bodies were buried under American supervision, often in mass graves already filled with the victims of SS brutality. Liberation came, but for many, it came too late. For the American soldiers, the work was relentless. Guards stood watch not against escape, but against collapse. Medical orderlies cleaned bodies, living and dead. Engineers repaired water systems and sanitation lines. Chaplains moved quietly among survivors and troops alike, offering presence when words failed. The psychological toll on the liberators was profound and enduring. Many veterans later described Dachau as the defining experience of the war, not combat, not victory, but revelation. Nightmares followed them home. Some never spoke of what they had seen. Others struggled to reconcile their actions that day with the values they believed they were fighting for. The shootings of SS guards remained an unspoken undercurrent. For some, it was a moment of grim justice. For others, a source of private unease. Official silence left room for memory to harden in different directions. Dachau itself became a symbol almost immediately. Journalists and photographers spread images across the United States and Europe. The camp was preserved as evidence, visited by Allied leaders, war crimes investigators, and eventually the German public. It was no longer merely a crime scene, it was a warning. In the years that followed, Dachau would be referenced in trials, textbooks, and memorials. The SS guards who ran it became examples of systematic evil. The prisoners became witnesses to history. And the American soldiers who liberated it became reluctant carriers of its legacy. The aftermath of Dachau did not resolve cleanly. It settled instead into memory, fragmented, heavy, and permanent. The war in Europe would officially end within days, but for those who passed through Dachau on April 29, the war never truly ended at all. What remained was the question that Dachau forced upon the world: how should humanity respond when confronted with proof of organized cruelty on such a scale? That question would linger long after the smoke cleared, and it would shape how history remembers not only the crimes of the SS, but the men who arrived too late to stop them, and yet early enough to bear witness. Dachau was not liberated in triumph. It was uncovered. On April 29, 1945, American soldiers did not arrive as conquerors stepping into victory. They arrived as witnesses, forced without warning to confront what modern states were capable of doing to human beings when ideology erased restraint. The camp did not challenge their courage. It challenged their understanding of right, wrong, and responsibility. The killings of SS guards that day sit uncomfortably in history because they refuse simple categorization. They were neither sanctioned by justice nor mindless cruelty. They were the result of moral shock colliding with military discipline at the precise moment when the full weight of Nazi crimes became undeniable. The U.S. Army chose silence not to excuse the act, but to contain a fracture that risked overshadowing a far greater truth. That truth was Dachau itself. The camp revealed that evil could be organized, normalized, and maintained by ordinary men following procedures. It showed that mass murder did not require chaos, only obedience, time, and indifference. And it demonstrated that even those who arrive to stop such systems are not immune to being changed by what they find. In the end, Dachau did not offer closure. It offered responsibility, to remember accurately, to judge carefully, to resist the comfort of simple narratives. The liberation forced the world to acknowledge not only what had been done, but what it demanded of those who came after. History does not ask us to excuse what happened at Dachau, on either side of the barbed wire. It asks us to understand it fully, because understanding is the only safeguard against repetition. And that is why Dachau remains more than a place. It remains a warning.